Margaret Washington had been serving lunch at Lincoln High School for 15 years. Every morning at 5:30, she would arrive at the empty cafeteria, her keys jingling as she unlocked the heavy metal doors. The fluorescent lights would flicker on, casting their harsh glow over rows of empty tables and chairs stacked high. At 52 years old, Margaret moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Her hands, weathered from years of washing dishes and preparing meals, knew every corner of that kitchen like a pianist knows the keys. She would tie her hair net carefully, wash her hands thoroughly, and begin the daily ritual of feeding 800 hungry teenagers. The other staff members respected Margaret. She never complained about the long hours or the demanding work. When the industrial dishwasher broke down, she rolled up her sleeves and washed every plate by hand. When students forgot their lunch money, she would quietly slip them a sandwich, never making them feel ashamed. But respect from her colleagues didn't shield Margaret from the daily cruelty of some students. They saw her dark skin, her simple uniform, and her quiet demeanor, and they made assumptions. To them, she was just the lunch lady who served their food and cleaned their messes. They never bothered to learn her name or see her as a person with dreams, struggles, and extraordinary hidden talents. The worst offenders were a group of seniors who called themselves the Elite Squad. Led by Brad Morrison, the mayor's son, they treated everyone they considered beneath them with contempt. Brad's father had money and influence in their small town, and Brad wore that privilege like armor. His friends Jason, Tyler, and Connor followed his lead, desperate to stay in his good graces. Every day during lunch period, they would make cruel comments just loud enough for Margaret to hear. They would complain about their food being served by dirty hands and make jokes about her appearance. When she would bend down to wipe tables, they would whisper and laugh, pointing in her direction. Margaret endured it all with quiet dignity. She had faced worse discrimination in her life and had learned that responding to bullies often made things worse. But their words cut deep, especially because she knew that if they took just one moment to see her as a human being, they would discover something that would shock them completely. The truth was that Margaret Washington possessed one of the most brilliant mathematical minds their town had ever produced. In the evenings, after her long shifts at the school, she would go home to her small apartment and solve complex mathematical problems that would stump most university professors. Her coffee table was covered with notebooks filled with equations, theorems, and proofs that she worked on for pure enjoyment. Mathematics had been Margaret's first love since childhood. She could see patterns and relationships in numbers that others couldn't even imagine. But life had other plans for her. When she was 18 and ready for college, her mother fell seriously ill. As the eldest daughter, Margaret put aside her dreams of studying mathematics to care for her family and work to support them. Years passed, and by the time her responsibilities lessened, she felt it was too late to pursue her education. She took the job at Lincoln High School because it provided steady income and health insurance. But she never stopped learning, never stopped solving problems, never stopped being brilliant. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, surrounded by students studying algebra and geometry, while she could solve problems that their teachers couldn't even understand. But she kept her gift hidden, partly from modesty and partly from the painful knowledge that few people would believe that the quiet lunch lady possessed such extraordinary abilities. Sometimes, when she overheard students struggling with math homework at lunch, she would want to help. She would see them getting frustrated over problems she could solve in seconds, and her heart would ache with the desire to guide them. But she knew that offering help would only invite more ridicule. Who would accept mathematical advice from the person who served their mashed potatoes? The morning that would change everything started like any other. Margaret arrived early, prepared the day's meals, and set up the serving line. She watched through the kitchen window as students began filing into the cafeteria, their voices creating the familiar buzz of teenage conversation. Brad Morrison and his friends claimed their usual table near the center of the room, where they could hold court and ensure everyone noticed them. They spoke loudly about their weekend plans, their expensive clothes, and their college prospects. Brad was headed to an elite private university, a path paved by his father's donations and connections rather than his mediocre grades. As Margaret served lunch that day, she noticed something different. The students seemed more agitated than usual, and there was an undercurrent of excitement in the air. She soon learned why. The school's math department had just posted a notice about an impossible problem that had stumped everyone, including the teachers. The problem had been written on the whiteboard in the main hallway, and students were gathering around it all day, trying to make sense of the complex equations. It was a puzzle that combined elements of advanced calculus, number theory, and abstract algebra. The math department had offered extra credit to any student who could solve it, but after 3 days, no one had even come close. Word had spread that even Mr. Peterson, the calculus teacher with a PhD from MIT, had spent hours trying to crack it without success. The problem had become the talk of the school, with students either attempting solutions or declaring it impossible. That afternoon, as Margaret cleaned tables and prepared to close the cafeteria, she couldn't help but walk past the hallway where the problem was displayed. A small crowd of students still surrounded the whiteboard, their faces showing a mixture of fascination and defeat. Margaret glanced at the problem and immediately saw the solution. It was like looking at a familiar friend. The equations seemed to dance before her eyes, revealing their secrets in a way that felt almost magical. She could see not just one solution, but 3 different approaches that would work, each more elegant than the last. But she said nothing. She simply continued with her work, sweeping the floors and wiping down surfaces, invisible as always to the students who walked past her. Tomorrow would bring another day of serving food and enduring insults, while the brilliant mathematical mind that could solve their impossible problem remained hidden behind a hairnet and a uniform. Little did Margaret know that tomorrow would be the day when everything changed, when her secret would be revealed in the most unexpected way, and when the students who had mocked her would learn a lesson about assumptions, respect, and the extraordinary potential that exists in every person we too quickly judge. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Lincoln High School. Dr. Amanda Chen, a renowned mathematician from the State University, had heard about the impossible problem that was stumping an entire school. As someone who specialized in the exact type of advanced mathematics involved, she was curious to see the problem firsthand and perhaps offer some guidance to the struggling students. Principal Davidson greeted Dr. Chen enthusiastically. The school prided itself on academic excellence, and having a university professor visit was a source of great pride. Dr. Chen was given a tour of the facilities, including the math wing where the famous problem still adorned the whiteboard, surrounded by failed attempts and eraser marks from desperate students. "This is quite impressive," Dr. Chen said, studying the equations carefully. "Whoever created this problem has a deep understanding of mathematical principles. It combines several advanced concepts that most high school students wouldn't encounter until graduate-level studies." Mr. Peterson, the calculus teacher, stood nearby beaming with pride, though he carefully avoided mentioning that he hadn't created the problem himself. It had actually been submitted anonymously, slipped under his classroom door early one morning with no name attached. He had assumed it came from a gifted student or perhaps another teacher trying to challenge the class. As Dr. Chen examined the problem more closely, her expression grew increasingly intrigued. "This isn't just difficult," she murmured to herself. "This is actually quite sophisticated. The person who wrote this understands some very advanced mathematical concepts." Meanwhile, in the cafeteria, Margaret continued her morning routine. She had heard whispers about a university professor visiting the school, but such events were common enough that she paid little attention. Her focus was on preparing lunch for hundreds of hungry students, ensuring everything was ready when the lunch period began. Brad Morrison and his friends arrived at their usual table, louder and more obnoxious than ever. Brad was in a particularly foul mood because he had spent the previous evening struggling with his calculus homework, failing miserably at problems far simpler than the one posted in the hallway. "I don't know why they bother with that stupid math problem," Brad complained as Margaret served his lunch. "It's probably fake anyway. No one's going to solve it because it's impossible." His friend Jason nodded in agreement. "Yeah, even Peterson can't figure it out. And he's supposed to be some kind of genius. I bet if you solved it, you'd get into any college you wanted," Connor added, though they all knew none of them had the mathematical ability to even understand what the problem was asking. Margaret listened to their conversation as she served their food, careful not to let any emotion show on her face. She had learned long ago that showing interest in academic subjects only invited more ridicule. To these boys, she was supposed to be ignorant, and any sign of intelligence would be met with disbelief and mockery. After serving lunch, Margaret had a brief break before beginning the cleanup process. She decided to walk past the math wing, curious to see the problem again and perhaps catch a glimpse of the famous professor everyone was talking about. As she approached the hallway, she could hear Dr. Chen speaking with a group of teachers and administrators. The mathematician was explaining some of the concepts involved in the problem, her voice filled with genuine excitement about the mathematical principles at play. The beauty of this problem, Dr. Chen was saying, is how it weaves together different mathematical disciplines. Someone with a truly exceptional understanding of mathematics created this. It's the kind of problem you might see in a doctoral dissertation. Margaret paused at the edge of the crowd, staying far enough back that she wouldn't be noticed. She studied the problem again, and once more the solution appeared clearly in her mind. She could see exactly how to approach it step by step. More than that, she could see several alternative solutions, each highlighting different mathematical principles. What struck her most was that Dr. Chen was right about one thing. Whoever had submitted this problem did indeed have an exceptional understanding of mathematics. But what the professor didn't know was that the problem hadn't been submitted by anyone at the school. Margaret had seen a similar problem in one of her advanced mathematics journals at home, and she had adapted it, making it even more complex and elegant. She had written it out one evening and slipped it under Mr. Peterson's door on a whim, curious to see if anyone at the school could solve it. She hadn't expected it to create such a sensation or attract the attention of a university professor. As Margaret stood there listening, Brad Morrison and his friends appeared in the hallway. They pushed through the crowd of younger students, claiming their right to be at the front simply because they were seniors. "So, Professor," Brad said with the cocky confidence that came from his privileged background, "what do you think? Is this thing actually solvable? Or is it just meant to make us look stupid?" Dr. Chen smiled patiently.
"Oh, it's definitely solvable."
"In fact, I'd say there are probably multiple ways to approach it, but it would require someone with a very strong mathematical foundation and the ability to think creatively about how different mathematical concepts connect." "Well, I'm pretty good at math," Brad lied smoothly. His actual grades in mathematics were barely passing, but his father's influence meant teachers rarely pushed him too hard. "Maybe I should take a shot at it," Tyler laughed. "Yeah, right, Brad. You couldn't even figure out the homework Peterson assigned yesterday." "That was different," Brad snapped, his face reddening. "This is just about being smart enough to see the pattern." Dr. Chen watched this exchange with growing discomfort. She had encountered enough privileged students in her career to recognize the type. Those who expected intelligence to be handed to them along with everything else, who confused confidence with competence. "Mathematical ability isn't about being naturally smart," Dr. Chen said carefully. "It's about patience, practice, and the willingness to think deeply about problems. Some of the most brilliant mathematicians I know come from very unexpected backgrounds." Margaret felt a flutter of hope at these words. Here was someone who understood that intelligence didn't come with a pedigree, that mathematical genius could be found anywhere. For a moment, she imagined what it would be like to step forward, to reveal that she could solve the problem, to show these arrogant students that their assumptions about her were completely wrong. But fear held her back. Fear of ridicule, fear of disbelief, fear of the chaos that would follow. These students already treated her with contempt for being the lunch lady. How much worse would it get if she claimed to be smarter than their teachers? As the crowd began to disperse, Dr. Chen lingered in the hallway, continuing to study the problem. She pulled out her phone and took a picture of the equations. Something about this problem intrigued her beyond mere academic curiosity. There was an elegance to it, a sophistication that suggested its creator was someone with genuine mathematical talent. Margaret slowly walked back toward the cafeteria, her mind churning with conflicting emotions. She had created something that had captured the attention of a renowned university professor, yet she couldn't claim credit for it. She possessed the solution to a problem that was stumping an entire school, yet she had to remain silent. As she began cleaning up after lunch, she overheard more students talking about the problem and the professor's visit. Word was spreading that Dr. Chen thought the problem was definitely solvable, which had renewed interest among the student body. "I heard she said it was graduate-level stuff," one student whispered to another. "Yeah, but she also said it could be solved if you understood the connections between different types of math," replied her friend. Margaret continued wiping down tables, invisible as always. while around her the students speculated about mathematical concepts they barely understood. She wondered what they would say if they knew that the person who could unlock the mystery of their impossible problem was standing right there among them. Wearing a hairnet and holding a dish rag, the irony was almost too much to bear. But tomorrow would bring new developments that would test Margaret's resolve to remain hidden and force her to make a choice between safety and truth. The next day brought an announcement that sent waves of excitement through Lincoln High School. Dr. Chen had been so intrigued by the mathematical problem that she had decided to extend her visit. She would spend the entire week at the school, working with students and teachers to explore advanced mathematical concepts. More importantly, she had convinced the administration to offer a substantial reward for whoever could solve the impossible problem. Principal Davidson made the announcement during morning assembly, his voice booming with pride. Thanks to Dr. Chen's generous offer, we now have a $5,000 scholarship waiting for any student who can crack this mathematical mystery. Additionally, the solver will receive a guaranteed admission interview at the State University's mathematics program. The cafeteria buzzed with renewed energy as students discussed their chances. $5,000 was serious money to most of these teenagers, and the university opportunity was even more valuable. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be a mathematician. Brad Morrison sat at his usual table, his jaw clenched with frustration. The scholarship money meant nothing to him. His father could buy his way into any university he wanted. But the prestige, the glory of being the one to solve what had stumped everyone else, that was something he craved desperately. I'm going to figure this thing out, he declared to his friends. How hard can it be? It's just math. You're going to need help, Jason said honestly. Maybe you should ask Peterson for some hints. I don't need hints, Brad snapped. I just need to focus on it properly. I've been too busy with other things to give it my full attention. Margaret overheard this conversation as she served their lunch. She had to bite her tongue to keep from laughing at Brad's arrogance. She had watched him struggle with basic algebra problems when he thought no one was looking. The idea that he could solve a graduate-level mathematics problem was absurd. But Brad's determination was real, even if misguided. That afternoon he planted himself in front of the whiteboard with a notebook and calculator, making a big show of his mathematical efforts. Other students gathered to watch, some genuinely hoping he would succeed, others waiting to see him fail spectacularly. For 2 hours, Brad scribbled equations, erased them, and scribbled again. His frustration grew with each passing minute as the problem remained stubbornly unsolved. Worse, he was beginning to realize that he didn't even understand what the problem was asking, let alone how to solve it. Dr. Chen appeared in the hallway and observed Brad's efforts with professional interest. She could see immediately that he was approaching the problem completely wrong, trying to force solutions that couldn't possibly work. Would you like some guidance? She offered gently. Brad's face burned with embarrassment, but his pride wouldn't let him accept help in front of the watching students. No thanks, I've got it under control. Just working through some possibilities. Dr. Chen nodded and moved on, but Margaret had been watching the entire exchange from nearby. She could see the mathematical mistakes Brad was making, could see exactly where his reasoning went wrong, and she felt an almost physical need to correct his errors. That evening, Margaret went home to her small apartment and sat at her kitchen table with the problem fresh in her mind. She pulled out a notebook and began working through the solution, not because she needed to, but because the mathematics was so beautiful, she couldn't resist exploring every aspect of it. Her pencil moved across the page with smooth confidence, each step building naturally on the previous one. She worked through the first approach she had envisioned, then explored the 2 alternative methods she had considered. Each solution was elegant in its own way, revealing different insights into the mathematical relationships at play. As she worked, Margaret felt the familiar joy that mathematics had always brought her. This was who she really was. Not the invisible lunch lady, but a brilliant thinker capable of grappling with the most complex mathematical concepts. For these precious hours at her kitchen table, she could be herself completely. But as morning approached, she would have to put on her uniform again, tie her hair back, and return to being invisible. The notebook with her solutions would go into a drawer with dozens of others, filled with mathematical work that no one would ever see. The next morning at school, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had spread that several students were making serious attempts at the problem, and Dr. Chen had promised to be available all day to check any proposed solutions. Brad Morrison arrived early, determined to be the first one at the whiteboard. He had spent the previous evening watching YouTube videos about advanced mathematics, though most of the concepts went completely over his head. Still, he was convinced that persistence would eventually lead to breakthrough. As the day progressed, more students tried their hand at the problem. Some made genuine attempts based on mathematical reasoning, while others simply threw random equations at the wall hoping something would stick. Dr. Chen patiently reviewed each effort, offering encouragement while gently explaining why various approaches wouldn't work. Margaret watched these attempts with growing unease. She could see that several students were getting discouraged, beginning to believe that the problem truly was impossible. She could also see that Brad Morrison was becoming increasingly frustrated and angry with each failed attempt. During lunch period, Brad's mood had soured completely. He took out his frustration on everyone around him, but especially on Margaret as she served his food. "This whole thing is stupid," he muttered loud enough for her to hear. "Probably some trick problem that doesn't even have a real answer. Just a way to make us look like idiots." "Maybe it's too hard for high school students," Tyler suggested. "It's not too hard," Brad insisted. "It's just that nobody around here is smart enough. This place is full of losers." His eyes fell on Margaret as she wiped down a nearby table. "I bet even the lunch lady thinks she could solve it," he said with a cruel laugh. His friends joined in the laughter, and several other students looked over to see what was so funny. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she continued her work without responding. "What do you think, Margaret?" Brad called out, using her name with mocking emphasis. "Want to take a shot at our impossible math problem? I bet you're just dying to show us how smart you are." The cafeteria had grown quieter, and Margaret could feel dozens of eyes on her. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent years trying to avoid. She knew that any response would only make things worse. "Oh, come on," Brad continued, emboldened by his audience. "Don't be shy. I'm sure you have some great mathematical insights to share with us. Maybe they didn't teach advanced calculus in lunch lady school?" The cruelty in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt something inside her begin to crack. She had endured years of disrespect and invisibility, but this public humiliation was different. This felt like a challenge she couldn't ignore. For just a moment, she imagined walking over to that whiteboard and showing them all exactly what she could do. She imagined the look on Brad's face when she solved their impossible problem with elegant precision. She imagined Dr. Chen's surprise and respect when she revealed the depth of her mathematical knowledge, but fear still held her back. The consequences of revealing her abilities seemed too dangerous, too unpredictable. She simply finished wiping the table and walked back to the kitchen, her head held high despite the laughter that followed her. What Margaret didn't know was that Dr. Chen had entered the cafeteria during Brad's cruel performance. The mathematician had heard enough to understand what was happening, and she felt disgusted by the young man's behavior. She had also noticed something else. A flash of something in Margaret's eyes when the mathematics was mentioned. A look that suggested far more understanding than anyone realized. As Margaret disappeared into the kitchen, Dr. Chen found herself wondering about the quiet woman who served lunch every day. Something about her reaction to Brad's taunts had seemed different from mere embarrassment. It had looked almost like the frustrated expression of someone who knew exactly how wrong Brad was, but couldn't say so. The day was ending. But tomorrow would bring the moment when Margaret's secret could no longer stay hidden, when circumstances would force her to choose between silence and truth. Thursday morning brought unexpected drama to Lincoln High School. Brad Morrison had arrived at school before dawn, determined to solve the mathematical problem through sheer force of will. He had covered 2 additional whiteboards with his attempts, filling them with increasingly desperate calculations that made no mathematical sense. When Dr. Chen arrived and saw his work, she couldn't hide her concern. Brad had not only failed to make progress, but his attempts showed a fundamental misunderstanding of basic mathematical principles. Worse, his angry erasures and overwrites had made the original problem nearly illegible. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Chen said carefully, "I think you might benefit from taking a step back and reviewing some foundational concepts before tackling something this advanced." Brad's face flushed red. After 3 days of public failure, his patience had completely evaporated. "There's nothing wrong with my foundations," he snapped. "This problem is just poorly written. Maybe whoever created it made mistakes." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Chen had spent considerable time analyzing the problem and knew it was mathematically sound. More than that, she was increasingly convinced that whoever had created it possessed exceptional mathematical talent. "I can assure you the problem is correct," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Every equation is precisely balanced and the solution follows logically from the given parameters." "Then prove it," Brad demanded, his voice carrying across the hallway. "If you're so sure it can be solved, solve it yourself." A crowd of students had gathered, drawn by the confrontation. They sensed drama unfolding and positioned themselves to witness whatever happened next. Brad had essentially challenged a university professor to solve the problem publicly, turning the mathematical exercise into a test of reputations. Dr. Chen found herself in an uncomfortable position. She was confident the problem was solvable, but she hadn't actually worked through the solution herself. She had been treating it as a learning exercise for students, focusing on guidance rather than complete solutions. Now, with dozens of eyes on her, she was being asked to deliver what she had claimed was possible. "Very well," she said, accepting the challenge. "Let me work through this systematically." Word spread quickly through the school that the university professor was attempting to solve the impossible problem. Students abandoned their classes, teachers found excuses to visit the math wing, and even Principal Davidson appeared to witness the spectacle. Dr. Chen began working methodically, her marker squeaking against the whiteboard as she wrote out equations and explored different approaches. The crowd watched in respectful silence as she demonstrated the kind of systematic thinking that characterized professional mathematics. Minutes passed, then an hour. Dr. Chen's initial confidence began to waver as she encountered unexpected complications. The problem was more sophisticated than she had realized, with subtle interconnections that weren't immediately apparent. She found herself erasing and restarting multiple times, her frustration growing with each false start. Margaret had heard about the commotion and found an excuse to walk past the math wing during her break. When she saw Dr. Chen struggling at the whiteboard, her heart sank. The professor was making the same mistake that most mathematicians would make, approaching the problem linearly instead of recognizing its multidimensional structure. "Having trouble, Professor?" Brad asked with obvious satisfaction after Dr. Chen had erased her fourth attempt. "Maybe this problem isn't as solvable as you thought." Dr. Chen ignored the taunt and continued working, but Margaret could see the pressure building. The crowd was getting restless, and whispers were beginning to circulate about whether the university professor was really as smart as everyone had assumed. The breakthrough moment came when Dr. Chen tried a completely different approach, one that brought her close to the correct path. Margaret watched intently as the professor wrote out a series of equations that were almost right, but contained a critical error in the third step that would derail the entire solution. Margaret found herself leaning forward, willing Dr. Chen to see the mistake. She wanted to call out, to point to the error, to help this kind woman who had defended the possibility that mathematical genius could come from unexpected places. But she remained frozen, trapped by years of conditioning that told her to stay invisible. Dr. Chen continued down the wrong path, her calculations becoming increasingly complex as she tried to force a solution that couldn't work. After another 30 minutes, she stepped back from the whiteboard with obvious frustration. "I need more time to work through this systematically," she admitted. "The problem is definitely solvable, but it requires more careful analysis than I can provide in this public setting." Brad Morrison seized on this admission like a victory. "So you can't solve it either," he said triumphantly. "Maybe it really is impossible. Maybe we've all been wasting our time on some fake problem." "The problem is not fake," Dr. Chen insisted, but her credibility had taken a serious blow. She had publicly claimed the problem was solvable and then failed to solve it herself. The crowd began to disperse, students heading back to their classes with disappointed expressions. The magical mathematics competition had turned into an anticlimactic failure, leaving everyone feeling deflated. Margaret watched Dr. Chen erase her failed attempts, and something inside her finally snapped. This brilliant, kind woman was being humiliated because of a problem that Margaret had created and could solve effortlessly. Dr. Chen had shown respect for the mathematical abilities of others and defended, The idea that intelligence could come from anywhere. She deserved better than this public failure. As the hallway emptied, Margaret made a decision that terrified her. She walked slowly toward Dr. Chen, who was still staring at the whiteboard with a puzzled expression. "Excuse me, Professor," Margaret said quietly. Dr. Chen turned, surprised to see the lunch lady approaching. "Oh, hello. I'm sorry, I don't think we've been introduced." "I'm Margaret Washington," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I work in the cafeteria." "It's nice to meet you, Margaret. I'm Amanda Chen." The professor's voice was kind despite her obvious frustration with the mathematical problem. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that the next words out of her mouth would change everything. "Professor Chen, I think I might be able to help you with that problem." Dr. Chen blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "The mathematical problem," Margaret repeated, her voice growing slightly stronger. "I believe I can solve it." For a moment, Dr. Chen didn't know how to respond. The cafeteria worker was offering to solve a graduate-level mathematics problem that had stumped both a university professor and an entire school. It seemed impossible, yet something in Margaret's quiet confidence suggested this wasn't a joke or a misunderstanding. "Margaret," Dr. Chen said carefully, "this is a very complex problem involving advanced calculus, number theory, and abstract algebra. Are you familiar with these mathematical concepts?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, Professor. I've been studying mathematics independently for many years. I know this might sound strange, but I'm quite certain I can solve your problem." The hallway was empty now except for the two women. Dr. Chen studied Margaret's face, looking for signs of delusion or misplaced confidence. Instead, she saw something that looked remarkably like the quiet certainty of someone who truly understood what they were talking about. "All right," Dr. Chen said slowly. "Show me." Margaret approached the whiteboard with trembling hands. This was the moment she had both dreaded and dreamed of for years. As she picked up the marker, she knew that there was no going back. In the next few minutes, she would either prove herself a mathematical genius or confirm everyone's assumptions about her limitations. What happened next would shock everyone who thought they knew Margaret Washington. Margaret's hand shook slightly as she raised the marker to the whiteboard. For 15 years she had hidden her mathematical abilities, watching from the sidelines as others struggled with problems she could solve effortlessly. Now in this moment of truth, all her fears and self-doubt came rushing back. "Take your time," Dr. Chen said gently, sensing Margaret's nervousness. "There's no pressure here." But Margaret knew there was enormous pressure. If she failed, if her years of private study hadn't prepared her for this moment, she would face humiliation beyond anything she had experienced before. Everyone would know that the lunch lady had the audacity to think she was smarter than a university professor. She began by studying the problem once more, though she had memorized every detail long ago. The equations seemed to welcome her like old friends, their relationships and patterns as clear as daylight. She could see the solution path as clearly as if someone had drawn her a map. Margaret started writing, her initial strokes hesitant but growing more confident with each symbol. She began with a transformation that Dr. Chen had attempted earlier. But instead of following the linear progression that had trapped the professor, Margaret introduced a dimensional shift that revealed the problem's hidden structure. "Interesting approach," Dr. Chen murmured, leaning forward to study Margaret's work. "I hadn't considered that transformation." Margaret's confidence grew as she continued. Mathematics had always been her sanctuary, the one place where she felt completely herself. As she worked through the solution, years of hiding and pretending fell away. This was who she really was. Not the invisible cafeteria worker, but a mathematical mind capable of seeing patterns that others missed. The solution flowed from her marker like poetry. Each step built naturally on the previous one, creating an elegant logical progression that made the complex problem seem almost simple. Margaret introduced concepts that Dr. Chen recognized as graduate-level mathematics, applying them with a fluidity that spoke of deep understanding. "My goodness," Dr. Chen whispered as Margaret approached the final steps. "This is absolutely brilliant." Word had somehow spread that something unusual was happening in the math wing. Students began appearing in the hallway, drawn by curiosity and the hope that someone had finally cracked the impossible problem. They gathered quietly, afraid to interrupt whatever was unfolding at the whiteboard. Margaret was so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice the growing audience. For the first time in years, she was able to be completely herself in public, to let her intelligence shine without apology or fear. The mathematical problem had become a vehicle for her liberation. As she wrote the final equation, Margaret felt a surge of pure joy. The solution was complete, elegant, and undeniably correct. She had not only solved the problem, but had done so in a way that demonstrated mastery of advanced mathematical concepts that most people would never encounter. She stepped back from the whiteboard and turned to face Dr. Chen, who was staring at the solution with an expression of amazement and disbelief. "Margaret," Dr. Chen said slowly, "this is extraordinary. Not only is your solution correct, but it's more elegant than any approach I had considered. Where did you learn to think about mathematics this way?" Before Margaret could answer, a voice cut through the hushed atmosphere of the hallway. "What's going on here?" Brad Morrison had returned, drawn by the crowd gathering in the math wing. He pushed through the students until he could see the whiteboard, his eyes scanning Margaret's work with growing confusion and anger. "Is this some kind of joke?" he demanded. "Did someone help her write this?" The accusation stung, but Margaret had expected it. She turned to face Brad with more confidence than she had ever felt in his presence. "No one helped me," Margaret said quietly. "I solved it myself." Brad's face turned red with indignation. "That's impossible. You're the lunch lady. You don't know advanced mathematics." "Apparently she does," Dr. Chen interjected firmly. "And she's done something that neither you nor I could accomplish. This solution is not only correct but demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of mathematical principles." The crowd of students pressed closer, trying to understand what was happening. Many of them had never heard Margaret speak more than a few words, and now she stood before them as the solver of their impossible problem. "I don't believe it," Brad insisted. "She must have copied it from somewhere. There's no way she could understand mathematics like this." Margaret felt a flame of anger ignite in her chest. Years of enduring his contempt, years of being treated as less than human came flooding back. But instead of responding with emotion, she chose to respond with intellect. "Which part would you like me to explain?" Margaret asked calmly. "The dimensional transformation in step 3? The application of Fermat's theorem in step 7? Or perhaps you'd like me to show you the 2 alternative solutions I considered before choosing this approach?" Brad's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He had no idea what she was talking about, and everyone in the hallway could see it. Dr. Chen stepped forward, her excitement barely contained. "Margaret, did you say there are alternative solutions? I'd very much like to see them." "Of course," Margaret replied, moving to a clean section of the whiteboard. "The approach I just showed uses dimensional transformation. But the problem can also be solved through recursive analysis or by applying advanced group theory principles." As Margaret began writing the second solution, the hallway filled with more students and teachers. Principal Davidson appeared, drawn by reports that something extraordinary was happening in the math wing. He arrived just in time to see Margaret demonstrating mathematical concepts that were beyond the curriculum of his school. The second solution was even more impressive than the first. Margaret worked through it with the same fluid confidence, explaining key steps as she went. Her explanations were clear and precise, showing not just computational ability, but deep conceptual understanding. "Remarkable," Dr. Chen breathed. "Margaret, where did you study mathematics? Which university did you attend?" The question hit Margaret like cold water, bringing her back to reality. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. The moment when she would have to explain why someone with her abilities was working as a lunch lady. "I never went to university," Margaret said quietly. "I've been studying independently since high school." The admission created a ripple of whispers through the crowd. Brad Morrison seized on it immediately. "See? I knew something was wrong. She doesn't even have a degree. She probably looked up the answers online or something." "That's enough," Dr. Chen said sharply. "Mr. Morrison, I've been teaching mathematics for 15 years, and I can recognize genuine mathematical understanding when I see it. Margaret has just demonstrated knowledge that would be impressive in a doctoral candidate. The source of her education is irrelevant compared to the depth of her understanding." But Margaret knew the questions wouldn't stop there. Now that her secret was out, everyone would want to know her story. They would want to understand how the invisible lunch lady had become a mathematical genius hiding in plain sight. As she looked out at the sea of shocked faces, students who had never bothered to learn her name, Teachers who had worked alongside her for years without recognizing her intelligence, administrators who had seen her only as part of the school's support staff. Margaret realized that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't predict. The solution on the whiteboard behind her represented more than just mathematical achievement. It was proof that brilliance could exist anywhere, that assumptions about people based on their jobs or circumstances could be devastatingly wrong. It was a challenge to everyone who thought they knew who mattered and who didn't in their world. But with that recognition would come new challenges, new expectations, and new decisions about what kind of life Margaret wanted to build for herself. The quiet anonymity that had protected her for so long was gone forever, replaced by a spotlight she had never sought but could no longer avoid. The news spread through Lincoln High School like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone knew that Margaret Washington, the quiet lunch lady who had served their food for 15 years, was actually a mathematical genius. The story grew with each telling, becoming more incredible with every repetition. Some students were amazed and embarrassed by their past behavior. They remembered countless times they had treated Margaret as invisible, never imagining that she possessed intelligence that far exceeded their own. Others, particularly Brad Morrison and his circle, refused to accept what had happened. "It has to be fake," Brad insisted to anyone who would listen. "She probably memorized some answers or got help from the internet. There's no way the lunch lady is actually smart." But his protest fell on increasingly deaf ears. Too many people had witnessed Margaret's explanation of her solutions, had seen her demonstrate knowledge that couldn't be faked or memorized. Dr. Chen's enthusiastic endorsement carried significant weight, and word was spreading beyond the school. Margaret herself was struggling with the sudden attention. For 15 years, she had been invisible. Now students who had never acknowledged her existence were approaching her with questions about mathematics. Teachers who had worked alongside her were stopping by the cafeteria to express their amazement and admiration. The most difficult part was dealing with the questions about her past. Everyone wanted to know how she had acquired such advanced mathematical knowledge, why she was working in a school cafeteria instead of pursuing an academic career, and what she planned to do now that her abilities were known. "I had to choose between my education and my family," Margaret explained to Dr. Chen during a private conversation after school. "My mother was sick and I was the oldest daughter. Someone had to work and take care of everyone." Dr. Chen nodded with understanding. She had seen this story before. Brilliant minds, particularly among women and minorities, whose potential had been sacrificed to family obligations and economic necessity. "But you never stopped learning," Dr. Chen observed. "That takes incredible dedication and self-discipline." Margaret smiled sadly. "Mathematics was the one thing I could never give up completely. I would stay up late solving problems, reading journals, working through textbooks I bought with whatever money I could spare. It kept me sane during the hardest times." "Margaret," Dr. Chen said seriously, "I want you to consider something. Your mathematical abilities are truly exceptional. With the right support and opportunities, you could pursue graduate studies, conduct original research, make real contributions to the field. It's not too late to change your path." The suggestion both thrilled and terrified Margaret. At 52 years old, was it really possible to start over? Could she transition from serving lunch to pursuing the mathematical career she had always dreamed of? Meanwhile, the story was attracting attention beyond Lincoln High School. Dr. Chen had shared Margaret's work with colleagues at the university, who were equally impressed by her mathematical sophistication. A local news reporter had heard about the story and was asking questions about the lunch lady who had solved the impossible problem. Principal Davidson found himself in an unexpected position. Margaret had been a reliable, hardworking employee for 15 years, but now he was learning that she was overqualified for her position in ways that were almost embarrassing. Other staff members were asking whether the school had known about her abilities, whether they had been wasting her talents all these years. The situation became even more complicated when the school board learned about Margaret's mathematical abilities. They were excited about the positive publicity the story was generating, but they were also concerned about the implications. If they had a mathematical genius working in their cafeteria, what did that say about their hiring practices and their ability to recognize talent? Brad Morrison's reaction grew increasingly hostile as the days passed. He couldn't accept that someone he had considered beneath him was actually far more intelligent than he would ever be. His pride couldn't handle the reversal of the social order that Margaret's revelation represented. He began spreading rumors about Margaret, suggesting that she had somehow cheated or that the problem itself had been rigged. When these tactics failed to gain traction, he escalated to more personal attacks, making comments about her race and background that revealed the ugly prejudices underlying his earlier behavior. "People like her don't become mathematicians," he said to his friends, not caring who might overhear. "There's something suspicious about this whole thing. Maybe she's got connections we don't know about. Or maybe someone is pushing an agenda." His comments eventually reached Margaret's ears, and she felt the familiar sting of discrimination that had followed her throughout her life. But now something was different. She had proven herself in the most objective way possible, through mathematical truth that couldn't be denied or dismissed. Dr. Chen, meanwhile, was working behind the scenes to create opportunities for Margaret. She had spoken with the dean of the mathematics department about offering Margaret a path to graduate studies. She had connected with foundations that provided scholarships for non-traditional students. She was determined that Margaret's talents wouldn't be wasted any longer. The breaking point came during a school board meeting where Margaret's situation was being discussed. Board members were debating whether to offer her a different position within the school system, perhaps as a mathematics tutor or teaching assistant. The meeting was supposed to be private, but word had leaked, and a small crowd had gathered. Brad Morrison's father, Mayor Morrison, was on the school board. He had been embarrassed by his son's public failure to solve the mathematical problem and was looking for ways to minimize the significance of Margaret's achievement. "I think we need to be careful not to make too much of this situation," Mayor Morrison said during the meeting. "We don't want to send the message that formal education doesn't matter, or that anyone can just claim to be an expert in mathematics." The implication was clear. He was questioning Margaret's qualifications and suggesting that her lack of formal credentials should disqualify her from recognition or advancement. Margaret, who had been invited to attend the meeting, felt years of frustration and suppressed anger rising within her. She had spent decades hiding her light under a bushel, accepting less than she deserved, allowing others to define her worth. But she was done with that now. She stood up slowly, her voice steady and strong when she spoke. "Mr. Morrison, mathematics doesn't care about formal credentials. It doesn't care about race or gender or social status. Mathematical truth is objective. Either a solution works or it doesn't. Either you understand the concepts or you don't." She paused, looking directly at the mayor. "I solved a problem that stumped your son, that stumped a university professor, that stumped an entire school. I didn't do it with a degree hanging on my wall. I did it with knowledge, understanding, and years of dedicated study. If that's not qualification enough, then perhaps you should reconsider what you really value in education." The room fell silent. Margaret had just publicly challenged one of the most powerful men in town, defending not just her own abilities but the principle that intelligence and worth couldn't be determined by superficial markers of status. What happened next would determine not just Margaret's future, but the future of every person who had ever been underestimated because of their circumstances, their background, or their position in society's hierarchy. Margaret's words hung in the air of the school board meeting room, creating a tension that everyone could feel. Mayor Morrison's face had turned red, whether from embarrassment or anger, no one could tell. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure how to respond to this unprecedented challenge to their authority. Dr. Chen, who had been observing quietly from the back of the room, chose this moment to stand and speak. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her academic credentials, "I'd like to add something to this discussion." She walked to the front of the room, her presence commanding attention. "I've been teaching mathematics at the university level for 15 years. I've worked with hundreds of students, from undergraduates to doctoral candidates. In all that time, I've rarely encountered mathematical thinking as sophisticated and intuitive as Margaret's." Dr. Chen turned to address Mayor Morrison directly. "You mentioned formal education, and I respect that. But formal education is meant to develop the kind of understanding that Margaret has clearly achieved on her own. When I see her work, I don't see someone lacking credentials. I see someone who has transcended the need for traditional validation through pure intellectual achievement." The room remained silent as Dr. Chen continued. "Margaret has been solving graduate-level problems for personal enjoyment, while working full-time in your cafeteria. She has maintained her mathematical skills through years of self-directed study, demonstrating a dedication to learning that most of my formal students could learn from. She paused, then delivered her conclusion with quiet force. If this school system cannot recognize and nurture the extraordinary talent that has been working among you for 15 years, then perhaps the problem isn't with Margaret's qualifications. Perhaps the problem is with your ability to see beyond surface assumptions about who deserves respect and opportunity. Mayor Morrison's face grew even redder, but before he could respond, something unexpected happened. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the school board's newest member and a former teacher herself, began to clap. Her applause started slowly, then grew more confident as she stood from her seat. Dr. Chen is absolutely right, Dr. Martinez said, her voice strong and clear. We should be celebrating Margaret, not questioning her qualifications. She represents everything we claim to value in education: intellectual curiosity, perseverance, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. One by one, other people in the room began to join the applause. Parents who had come to observe the meeting, teachers who had worked with Margaret, even some school board members began clapping. The sound filled the room, drowning out Mayor Morrison's attempts to restore order. But the most significant moment came when someone unexpected entered the room. Brad Morrison had been waiting outside, hoping to hear his father's defense of his pride. Instead, he walked into a room full of people applauding the woman he had spent years mocking and humiliating. For the first time in his privileged life, Brad was forced to confront the reality of his own limitations. He saw his father's red-faced embarrassment, heard the praise being lavished on someone he had considered beneath him, and realized that his entire worldview had been built on false assumptions. Margaret noticed Brad's entrance and saw the confusion and shame on his face. Despite everything he had put her through, she felt a moment of compassion for him. He was learning a hard lesson about the nature of worth and intelligence, and she remembered what it felt like to have your understanding of the world completely overturned. As the applause finally died down, Margaret found herself facing a room full of people who were looking at her with new eyes. The invisible lunch lady was invisible no longer. She had become a symbol of hidden potential, of the intelligence and capability that exists in unexpected places. Dr. Chen approached Margaret after the meeting, her eyes bright with excitement. "I've spoken with my department head," she said. "We would like to offer you a full scholarship to pursue a master's degree in mathematics. Your work credits and life experience would allow you to enter as an advanced student." The offer took Margaret's breath away. After decades of dreaming, the door to her mathematical future was finally opening. But she also felt the weight of responsibility that came with this opportunity. "There's one condition I'd like to add," Margaret said carefully. "If I accept this scholarship, I'd like to spend part of my time working with students who might be in situations similar to mine, people whose talents aren't being recognized because of their circumstances." Dr. Chen smiled broadly. "I think that's a wonderful idea. There's nothing more powerful than someone who has walked that path themselves." Over the following weeks, Margaret's story spread far beyond Lincoln High School. News outlets picked up the story of the lunch lady mathematician, and she found herself receiving letters and emails from people around the country who had been inspired by her journey. Many of the messages came from people who felt trapped in jobs that didn't reflect their abilities, from students who had been told they weren't smart enough for advanced mathematics, from parents who worried that their children's talents might go unrecognized. Margaret realized that her story had become bigger than just her own journey. She had become a symbol of the potential that exists in every person, regardless of their current circumstances or society's assumptions about their abilities. The changes at Lincoln High School were immediate and profound. Margaret's revelation had forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions about the people around them. Teachers began paying closer attention to staff members they had previously overlooked. Students started treating all school employees with more respect, understanding that intelligence and worth weren't determined by job titles. Brad Morrison faced the most difficult adjustment. His public humiliation had forced him to confront the cruelty and arrogance that had defined his behavior. Some of his friends distanced themselves from him, embarrassed by their association with his treatment of Margaret. But Brad surprised everyone, including himself, by seeking out Margaret before she left for her new life at the university. He found her in the cafeteria cleaning up after her final lunch service. "Mrs. Washington," he said quietly, using her name with genuine respect for the first time. "I owe you an apology." Margaret looked up from her work, studying the young man who had caused her so much pain. She saw something different in his eyes now: humility, shame, and what might have been the beginning of wisdom. "I was wrong about you," Brad continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see what everyone else can see now." Margaret considered his words carefully. She could have dismissed his apology, could have reminded him of years of cruelty and disrespect. Instead, she chose grace. "Brad," she said gently, "everyone deserves the chance to learn and grow. The fact that you're here apologizing tells me that you're capable of becoming the person you were meant to be. Don't let this experience make you bitter. Let it make you better." As Margaret packed up her belongings and prepared to leave Lincoln High School for the last time, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had spent 15 years hiding her light, protecting herself from disappointment and rejection. But in the end, the truth had found a way to emerge. She thought about all the students she had served over the years, many of whom had never bothered to see her as a complete person. Now they would remember her not as the invisible lunch lady, but as proof that extraordinary potential can exist anywhere, waiting for the right moment to shine. Margaret's story became a reminder that intelligence, creativity, and worth aren't determined by circumstances or assumptions. They exist in every person, often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone who believes in their potential to help them discover what they're truly capable of achieving. As she walked out of Lincoln High School for the final time, Margaret carried with her not just the satisfaction of recognition finally received, but the knowledge that her journey would inspire others to look beyond surface assumptions and recognize the hidden brilliance that exists in people everywhere. The lunch lady had become a mathematician, but more importantly, she had become a symbol of hope for anyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed because of who others thought they were supposed to be.